All right, can you guys hear me? Let me get this out of the way. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to this incredible conversation today. It's really exciting to be in Tennessee. I've learned so much already this morning and frankly can't wait to get off the stage and continue to hear what others have to say. But I'm also really excited to be talking with you today about what we're learning at Opportunity Insights around economic mobility and how that connects to employment, workforce, education, and so many other themes that have already been discussed this morning. So I think this is a nice piggyback to where we left off in the panel discussion just earlier, because at Opportunity Insights, what we do is we use big data, big administrative data from census, from IRS, from private sector, to really understand what are patterns in economic mobility across the country, and then to drill down to really understand what can we do to address economic mobility. And so if you'll bear with me, what I'm hoping to do over the next 20 minutes or so is sort of take a zoom out around what we're learning from that big data on economic opportunity and mobility, especially recent trends that we're seeing in terms of economic mobility, both across the country as well as in Tennessee. Speak a bit around what are the determinants we're seeing that are driving those patterns. And those determinants dovetail extremely well with the themes that have already come up this morning around workforce participation, around social capital, around higher education. And then talk a bit around the policy domains that we often think about at Opportunity Insights that we think can really address and improve economic mobility across the country. I hope that that'll sort of provide a grounding for then the local deep dives that Carrie and Paul will get us into, and then the subsequent sessions throughout the afternoon. I usually say at this point, feel free to interrupt me as I go, but in this case, maybe hold questions, but I will be flying through things, I fear, so feel free to grab me after this, and I'm happy to discuss more. So to start, this is a map that we actually developed at Opportunity Insights over a decade ago now, which I can hardly believe. And it's in very many ways, it's become a foundation of the kind of research questions that we've delved into since then, and is very much a foundation for how we think about opportunity. And so it's not a map that you may have seen before, but I just want to sort of ground the conversation today in what we've seen at that point and where it's led our thinking since then. And so to give you a sense of what this map is, it represents data on about 20 million children who were born in 1978 in the United States. We were able to take information on where those children grew up down to the census tract level, map that to the income of their families, their parents that they grew up in, and then map it forward in terms of what their income outcomes were as adults. In this case, their income at age 35. With that, we're able to see a picture across generations and across places as to what's happening with economic mobility. Typically, we're not able to see that at such a broad level if we're working with survey data alone, but in this case, we have such a robust data set that we can get a really accurate picture across the country. Now, this map in particular is specific to kids who grew up in low-income households, so households that are at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, which inflation adjusted is about $27,000 annually. And so just to make that quite concrete, you can see that children who grew up in Nashville, for instance, where we are now, they grew up in households that earned on average about $27,000 as they were growing up. Fast forward to what those kids made as adults at age 35, they were making about $29,000 at the household level. You can see along the key that we have a vast amount of variation across the country in where opportunity lives for those low-income children. So we've shaded that on the map so that the blue and green shaded areas are places that really show good upward mobility, lots of opportunity, sort of the opportunity to live the American dream, if you will, for low-income children. Those children go on to earn $10, $15, in some cases $20,000 more than the household that they grew up in. Conversely, we have other places in the country that are shaded in orange and red on the map where we're seeing either stagnant mobility or in some cases decline, where we see kids are actually earning less than the households that they grew up in. So that's like sort of the first major point of variation that we saw 10 years ago and that has continued to inform our work since then. But because of the robustness of the data, we're able to drill down even further and look at those same patterns at the census tract level. And so here you can see for 3 cities in Tennessee, in Nashville, in Memphis, in Chattanooga, you can see these same patterns emerge at the census tract level. This is the same color shading that I showed on the previous map, where red areas show places of downward mobility, green areas are showing places of upward mobility. This is important for not only showing those points of variation, but it also shows the granularity in the data and the places that are just adjacent to one another, literally on other sides of the road from one another, show very different experiences in terms of the opportunity experiences where those kids grow up. Now, I know that there are many other communities in Tennessee and across the country. You can actually go to the Opportunity Atlas, and for any community across the United States, you can look at this data for yourself, look at it by different income group, race group, gender group, and see what that opportunity looks like in that place and population. Now, from a scientific perspective, grab a glass of water. From a scientific perspective, this is exciting because it gives us sort of granularity. We think about it as this big data sort of offering a new lens, such as a microscope would make in sort of the biological sciences, to go deep and understand at a granular level what's happening in these places that we may have missed with sort of cruder, more broad strokes data. From a policy standpoint, it's also really exciting because it gives us those points of variation that can be indicative of what are the institutional differences, what are the policy differences that may have driven some places to be green on the map and other places to be orange on the map. And that gives us an opportunity to begin to learn from what are the proof points where we're seeing improved opportunity, and what does that mean about improving opportunity elsewhere in the country. Now, these are point-in-time snapshots from children who were born in 1978. When we released that data, it was exciting, but of course, the next question we got was, well, how is opportunity changing? What does this mean for children who were born more recently? One of the broad drawbacks of studying intergenerational mobility is that we have to wait for people to get old enough to get a valid read on what their earnings are as adults. But with the advent of time in the last 10 years, we were able to start to look at some of that trend data and see, is opportunity changing? And frankly, I think we were always a little bit nervous about what we would see, because we know that sort of that shadow cast by history can be really long and really powerful. And so to what extent is there really an opportunity to see places change across a policy relevant, relatively short time period? Well, what we saw is that there have been pronounced changes in mobility by race and by class. In some places, we've seen a narrowing of racial gaps in mobility and a broadening of class gaps in mobility. So let me sort of talk through that in a bit more detail. So on the left here, you see that, again, this is a map from children who were born in 1978, so very similar to the maps I showed previously. This time, as I'm going to restrict this to white children who were born into low-income households at that time, and it's the same color scale. Red indicates downward mobility, green, blue indicates upward mobility. Now we can map that forward and look at children who were born 15 years later in 1992. We're measuring their earnings in their late 20s at this point. And again, same color scale. You can see just by eyeballing that there's been a growth in sort of the red shading on the map. So a growth in downward mobility or a decline in economic mobility for white children who were born into low-income families, especially around the coast and things like that. So in other words, for children who were born in 1978, you had a fairly good shot of achieving the American dream, even if you were born into a low-income family. 15 years later, that had declined significantly. When we look at this same map for white children born into high-income families, we see a very different phenomena. We see fairly good upward mobility for white children in high-income families who were born in 1978. We see an even stronger trajectory or growth in upward mobility for white children born in high-income families. So a real growth in terms of the class gaps among white children. Now we can look at those same patterns among Black children. Here we have a map for Black children born into low-income families in 1978. You can see we've used a different color scale, which I'll speak to in just a moment as to why we did that. Purple here indicates downward mobility. Orange indicates upward mobility. Because of small sample sizes, we have some gray space throughout parts of the country. But in general, where we have sufficient sample sizes, we see similar patterns that we saw previously. Fast forward to Black children who were born into low-income families in 1992, and we see a growth in this orange shading, which shows that we've seen real progress in terms of upward mobility for Black low-income children. So this is encouraging, and it stands in sort of stark contrast to the decline that we saw among mobility among white low-income children. So in some cases, we're seeing a narrowing of those Black-white racial gaps, but a growth among class gaps in mobility among white children in particular. Now, it's important, I think, to come back to the differences in the shading, because it's very telling that although we have seen progress and that narrowing of the Black-white racial gap, there is still an enormous gap in mobility across race lines. So much so that we're not able to put these two maps, which are two maps for the 1992 birth cohorts, with Black low-income children on the left and white low-income children on the right, we're not able to put them on the same color scale, because essentially the best places in the country for Black low-income children to grow up are still worse than the worst places for white low-income children to grow up. So although we've seen progress, we still have a long way to go. Now you can go and you can look at these same patterns for Tennessee, which I did, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to pull up each of those, but we see those same patterns for each place in the country. Now, one question that often comes up when we talk about these results is, well, have somehow the improvements that we've seen in Black mobility been at the expense of white mobility? And I think it's really important to get on top of that zero-sum narrative that can sometimes emerge here. So this is a scatter plot of the most populous counties across the country. You can see that some of the counties in Tennessee have been overlaid there. And you see that the change in average household income is for white children is along the horizontal axis. Similarly, the change in household income for low-income Black children is along the vertical axis. Now, if this was a story of sort of a zero-sum mentality, we would see a negative correlation, essentially that line going in just the opposite direction. But in fact, we see this really strong positive correlation where the places that Black low-income children have done the best are the same places that we've seen white low-income children do the best. And so this is really a story where benefits or gains to one group are also gains to other groups that we're seeing in those communities. So with those patterns in mind, sort of our next layer of thinking is, well, what's really driving those patterns? What have been the determinants of economic mobility? And I will kind of walk us through what we're seeing in that, but not to bury the lead, what we see is that employment matters enormously, but not just for the current generation, but we're seeing this intergenerational effect around current labor force participation having an enormous impact on what we're seeing among children in the next generation. And similarly, or along the lines of that, how social capital plays into that. So to illustrate that, I want to talk first around why we're seeing those divergent trends in mobility across race and class lines, and how they're very much driven by changes in the local community, particularly changes in local adult employment patterns. And so to illustrate on that, what you see in this scatter plot, again, this is at the county level, but along the horizontal axis, you see changes in the employment rate. On the left-hand side, you see where we've seen declining labor force participation, improved labor force participation is up and over to the right. On the vertical axis, this is the change in income that we're seeing between that 1978 and 1992 period. The orange dots represent what we're seeing in that correlation for white low-income children or children born to low-income families. And you can see that white low-income children are much more exposed to communities where there's been declining labor force participation, and that is positively correlated with declining income as adults. Now, in the green dots, we see the same pattern, but this is for Black children born into low-income families. You can see that there's a similar correlation where exposure to varying levels of workforce participation among adults is positively correlated for what we see in their earnings as adults. But here, Black children have been very much less exposed to declining labor force participation in their communities. This is such a strong correlation that we were able to fit one straight line onto this. And what we think about in economics is a single factor influence. Now, you might be thinking, well, then this is a story about kids who are growing up in a household, their parent becomes unemployed. That has a bearing on their long-term outcomes. Interestingly, we can rerun this same visual or this same chart but we can restrict it to children whose parents remained employed, and we see the exact same pattern emerge. So it's not so much about what's happening in the immediate household, but about what's happening to parents or other adults in the community at large that seems to be most impactful to what we're seeing in terms of kids' long-term outcomes. So then, being researchers, we went on to test a number of different hypotheses around what does that really mean, this correlation between labor market participation and then the outcomes that we're seeing across generations in kids' earning outcomes. One is, why are changes in parental employment rates correlated with kids' outcomes? Is this a story around labor markets where a parent loses their job in a factory and that reduces the labor market opportunity for children 10 years later, 15 years later? Or is this more about something that kids are exposed to earlier in their childhood environment in terms of exposure to more employed parents that is changing perhaps their aspirations, how they think about things? I won't get into the specifics of how we actually tested out these models, but the upshot is that we see really strong evidence that this is about the influence of adult employment on childhood environment, and that there's a real dosage effect here. So the longer that young children are exposed to a community where there is lots of employment around them, the better outcomes that we're seeing, that it's not so much about labor markets. And that's important for thinking about how does this translate into policy interventions. Similarly, we've been thinking about, well, what are the actual mechanisms? Why does it matter so much to be surrounded by employed adults in the community? Is this something about sort of how it changes social interactions, how it changes the kind of networks that kids are exposed to, how they think about aspirations, who might be a mentor to them? Or is it about direct economic resources? Is it about if there's more resources in the community, does that change what's going into schools, what's going into local programs, things like that? And what we find in the evidence is that this is really a story about social interactions. It's not about how adult employment is materially changing the resources around kids. It's changing how they're actually pursuing different paths, how they're thinking about mentorship. It comes down to a social capital explanation. Now, that's quite similar or along the lines of research that we put out a few years ago that was looking at social capital writ large and how that influenced upward mobility. So this map on the left is the same map that you saw earlier in this conversation, looking at upward mobility across the country. The map on the right, which looks quite similar, is actually drawn from a completely different data set. It's drawn from Facebook data, and it shows what we call economic connectedness. So this is the degree to which low-income people have friendships with high-income people in a particular community. And I don't have to give you any statistics to just eyeball how similar those maps are. In fact, economic connectedness is the #1 predictor that we've seen of upward mobility amidst all the variables that we've looked at. Now, we've released something called the Social Capital Atlas, where you can drill down and see what economic connectedness looks like in every community in the United States, as well as every high school and every college in the United States, which for this group might be quite interesting. This is what economic connectedness and upward mobility look like in Memphis, Nashville, and Chattanooga. You can see the similarities across these maps. I think this is quite compelling in terms of seeing places that are sort of leading and lagging on economic connectedness. In addition to that, we're able to drill down and really see what are the contributors to economic connectedness, which we think of as both exposure, so are high and low income people in the same proximate spaces to one another, as well as friending bias. So conditional on people being in the same space, are they actually building meaningful relationships with one another? Both of those factors, friending bias and exposure, seem to contribute equally to economic connectedness, but speak to very different policy interventions. If you go to the Social Capital Atlas, you can see for each school, each zip code in the United States, where do exposure and friending bias stack up, and what does that suggest about different ways to intervene? So finally, in the last 5 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit about how we think of this evidence against sort of policy approaches that we think are quite important to be considering when we think about how to improve upward mobility. So these are sort of 3 different dimensions that we often think about. One is around reducing racial and economic segregation. How do we ensure that families and children have access to areas that are presently categorized as high opportunity? The second is around place-based interventions. What can we do to actually change mobility or change opportunity in a place? Can we change opportunity in a place so that at the end of the day, we don't have to look at this sort of bifurcated or multicolored map, that every place actually offers high opportunity to children? And then third, how do we think about higher education and workforce training? So in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the reducing segregation as much, except to say that there's incredibly exciting work happening at the federal and local level in both housing and education policy to really improve access to high opportunity areas in schools. Some of that is happening through the community choice demonstration here in Nashville. Happy to talk offline about what we're seeing in that a bit more specifically. So finally, I want to talk a bit about the role of higher education and workforce training, which is outside of neighborhoods, the other major institutions that we think about at Opportunity Insight as having an enormous bearing on upward mobility. So in terms of thinking about the contribution of higher education to economic mobility, we often think about this at OI along two different dimensions. What is the access to colleges? So sort of what you see along the horizontal axis there. And then given people going to college, what is the mobility rate? How well are colleges doing in actually spurring people from sort of the bottom 20% to the top 20%? What's that value add of college? And so these dots along here, we've mapped those two dimensions for about 400 different colleges across the country. These are actually a subset of those colleges for Tennessee schools. And you can see that on the left-hand side, we have programs like Vanderbilt or Rhodes College that are quite high in terms of their mobility rate. If you go there, then you are likely to experience upward mobility. But on the flip side, they serve a very low proportion of low-income students. And conversely, we see along the bottom there a number of schools that are community colleges and others that are serving a very large share of low-income students. So access is quite high, but don't have that same mobility rate. What we want to get to is seeing more institutions that are on that upper right quadrant of that. But as you can see, we have a real dearth of programs there. We're starting to see, if I go back, and this is a national map, so no longer at the Tennessee level, but we do have a few case examples of where we're seeing this in the orange dots. Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology is a technical college in Queens, the CUNY system in New York. These are examples of where we're starting to see this overlay of career counseling, workforce programming embedded within higher education that we think is quite interesting to think about, especially as I was hearing this morning around this sort of silo busting between education, higher ed, and workforce, really thinking about what is producing the highest mobility rates across these schools, and how do we get those schools that are already serving the majority of students, how do we bring them up on that mobility spectrum or along that vertical axis? So finally, want to end with some work that we're doing just recently as we've been thinking about the importance of technical skills training, workforce development, some evaluation that we've been doing of workforce development programs in particular. We were fortunate enough to start a partnership with Year Up several years ago and to use that broad administrative data that we have to look at the long-term outcomes of participants in Year Up. I'm assuming many folks in this room are already very familiar with Year Up. It's a workforce training program that works with youth, both in terms of classroom training, as well as providing internship support into high demand industry sectors. And they have done a number of evaluations around what the short and immediate term, or short and midterm gains have been of that. We were able to use our national data set to look at what the longer term outcomes were of Year Up, and saw that Year Up has shown pronounced gains in mobility for participants relative to a control group of folks who did not participate in Year Up, but look similar on every other dimension. It's about a $9,000 annual earnings gains from Year Up. So this is very exciting to see. And I think it got us thinking, as we've been thinking about how do we really estimate the value add of higher education, and how do we think about understanding impact analyses across this sort of growing range of workforce programs. How can we take this same approach and the data resources that we have and think more about workforce programs, not just with Year Up? And so we're currently working on a project where we're building out a data infrastructure with a number of other workforce programs across the country to really help us to estimate, one, what are those long-term impacts? And two, with that data sea that we're creating, how can we get more granular and specific around the particular modalities, characteristics of those programs that are most influential of high impact programs, so that, as was talked about in the panels this morning, we can be more evidence-based in how we think about sustaining and scaling programs. And so with that, I think that this was a huge amount of information, but I think that really boils down to three key takeaways as we think about how to both study and improve policy on economic mobility moving forward. One is that we need to focus on the childhood environment, and we need to think about sort of dosage effects within the childhood environment, knowing what an important role that plays in both children's long-term outcomes and in terms of intergenerational effects. The second is thinking about sort of the social community as the unit of analysis or unit for intervention. So not just thinking at the individual or even family level as a unit for intervention, but how can we really build opportunity across communities, especially those communities that have been left out of opportunity historically. And then finally, how do we really invest in social capital? Seeing social capital, social interactions as a through line across so many of these different spaces and areas. How do we understand more about that and really make it front and center around how we think about key levers for opportunity? And so with that, I will stop and hand this to Carrie. There are links to the Opportunity Atlas as well as the Social Capital Atlas. We try to always put all of our data out there as a public good, so hope that you'll explore it on your own and stay in touch about the good work that you all are doing. Thank you so much.